you for being here. This is Jose Barzola from the Matsunaga Institute for Peace, and I want to introduce to you our moderator / faculty for the office extraordinaire, Dr. Maya Soetoro. Take it away. Thank you so much, Maya.
Thank you so much, Jose, and thank you those who are in the room and those who are watching on other platforms or after the event. I am very grateful to you, Jose, for your work to set up these opportunities to converse, to deepen our understanding, and to be in community. Today is our Advocacy for Social Justice Talk Story series, and we always aim to explore organized efforts and mechanisms for social change. Today, we're speaking with Laura Rouse, who's a doctoral student at the University of Hawai'i at Mānoa, where she holds a master's degree in sociology and a graduate certificate in conflict resolution. Her research focuses on feminist criminology, punishment, restorative justice, and harm reduction. She specifically aims to study the troubled teen industry, of which she is now a survivor. She attended Northwest Academy from 2016 to 2017. Mahalo for being here and for sharing your work with us, Laura. And I'd like to, at this time, send the spotlight over to you for you to share with us a bit more about your work, research, passion, mission.
Sure, and thank you, Maya. I'm gonna share my screen really quickly so you guys can see my PowerPoint presentation.
And while you are doing that, I should tell everyone, please don't hesitate to put questions in the chat, and or whether it's on Facebook Live or here in the room, and let us know perhaps where you are dialing in from if you are in the room. Thank you, Laura. Go ahead.
Can everybody see this okay? Yes, okay. Today we're here talking about using peace building to heal the harms of the troubled teen industry. So for today's event, just a quick agenda. There's just a couple of kind of quick housekeeping things I wanted to discuss. I'm going to give you guys some background about what the troubled teen industry is and how it operates. Then Maya and I will have a conversation about the role of peace building and healing the harms of the troubled teen industry and my research on the topic. And then if anyone in the audience has any questions, we can do a Q&A. So just the quick housekeeping thing I mentioned is that this is obviously a very sensitive topic. It's talking about child abuse. It's not a light conversation. So if this is something that you feel you need to leave the session or step away from your computer, there is no judgment. You are definitely allowed to do that. And I wanted to just give everyone the space to be able to make that decision if that's something that you feel you need to do in the moment, because again, tough topic. As Maya said, my name is Laura. I am a doctoral student here at UH, and I study the troubled teen industry through the lens of punishment and restorative justice. You might be asking why, what qualifications I have to do that or talk about it. And really, the main thing I would say is that I was there. I was in one of these programs myself as a teenager, and I'm, a pretty active member of the community of survivors who are working on change, but we'll get to more on that later. So some fast facts about the troubled teen industry, which we'll define in a second, is that there are currently over 120,000 children residing in residential centers in the United States right now, meaning have been taken away from their homes and are in these programs. They've seen over 350 kids have died in these programs, either from suicide or from malnutrition, mistreatment, etc. And there are over 5,000 programs operating in the United States right now. So this might not be an issue that you've ever heard of before today, but it's definitely something that's pervasive and that's been occurring for the last century here. So what actually is the troubled teen industry? It is a network of residential behavior modification programs that operate mainly within the United States. There are programs in other countries, but its root was in the United States. And these programs are generally for-profit, and aimed toward treating juveniles and residential. So some examples of some kinds of troubled teen industry programs or programs that would fit within the paradigm of the troubled teen industry would be like wilderness therapy programs, therapeutic boarding schools, residential treatment programs, youth ranches. If you've seen Dr. Phil, for example, where he sends kids to the ranch, this is what he's talking about as one of these programs. So he specifically utilizes a program called Turnabout Ranch, which is where he sent, for example, Danielle Bergoli, or the Cash Me Outside girl. She attended one of these programs. And so each of these programs are different, kinds of programs are different in the way that they operate. For example, wilderness therapy is conducted mainly outside. It's a lot like what it sounds like. Just people, like kids who go outside, they may basically like utilizing hiking and being outside as a form of therapy, and that's about it. At therapeutic boarding schools are more long-term placements in boarding programs that utilize a residential structure, which is different than residential treatment programs because they offer some kind of schooling alternative. Most therapeutic boarding schools will offer some kind of high school diploma, credentialed or otherwise. So what makes someone a troubled teen? And the asterisk I've put here is according to these programs. This is a list that I pulled from a program called Second Nature. It's one of the more famous wilderness programs in the United States. So I don't know about you guys, but something that I've noticed about this list is this is a wildly diverse list of things that teens can struggle with. And I specifically enjoy that there are things on this list that are actually no longer considered to be diagnoses. For example, Asperger's has been taken out of the DSM for being named after a Nazi, but yet they still claim to treat it. But something that I noticed about this list is that it's a very diverse group of issues that teens struggle with. And yet these programs claim to treat them all in one way with one same model. And that to me immediately is a red flag because, everything that everyone struggles with is diverse. And all of these things require very different modalities of treatment. And yet the troubled teen industry uses the same kind of modality for all of them. So asking where this industry came from, there's a more in-depth timeline of the troubled teen industry can be found at this link, which I will make sure is available to everyone. That link is to a website run by the Survivors of Childhood Abuse, Childhood Institutional Abuse database. So it basically just has all sorts of information and resources that are really wonderful to provide information about the troubled teen industry. So again, I'll make sure that link is available, but these kind of charts, this is just two examples of the kind of timelines of how it started, but mainly what a lot of people credit this industry is starting with something called Synanon, which is next slide, which is a cult. So when you're talking about what kind of influenced the operation of the troubled teen industry, this is something that I really flushed out in my own research of these kind of seven modal things that influence the operation of the troubled teen industry. So of course, the first one is cults, because most of these programs came from Synanon cult model. So when Synanon was shut down, many former members went on to apply the things that they learned there in their work in programs. They also utilized 12-step recovery programs in most of these troubled teen industry facilities. For people who are struggling with addiction or not, it's something that's utilized just in general in their treatment model. So while that might be helpful for someone struggling with alcoholism, it might not be helpful for someone struggling with, say, anxiety. And yet it's something that's commonly utilized. They also, a lot of these programs find roots in religious institutions. Many are like, not to, shit on the Christians, but many are Christian-based programs and Christian-based boarding schools. And so that's another one. And then especially those religious-based programs tend to utilize conversion therapy. And now conversion therapy is illegal in many places in the country, yet that doesn't really stop them from utilizing conversion therapy. They just can't call it conversion therapy anymore or address it that specifically. So if you refer back to the earlier list of what makes someone a troubled teen, you'll see this one here is identity issues. That's really broad. And the way that most websites who are, advertising to parents describe identity issues is like children hanging out with the wrong crowd and things like that. And all of this is coded language for like your kid acting out or whatever it is, them being gay. And it's a way that programs can kind of advertise that, hey, we still treat this thing that doesn't need treating, but that they are still, even though it's not legal in whatever state, that they still, it's a kind of a coded language way to address parents who aren't able to accept their children's sexual identities or gender identities. I also find a lot of their rooting in adventure therapy. I talked about wilderness therapy a little bit earlier. And so really the kind of root of adventure therapy is like finding healing in the outdoors, which is something that in and of itself is a very interesting concept. But when you apply it to someone who's not there voluntarily and you're forcing children to be outside 12 hours, hiking 12, 18 miles a day, every day, sleeping outside for weeks, it's not, it becomes less about connecting with nature and more about unrelenting punishment. And then I also talked about military style boot camps, how they kind of utilize the boot camp model of like tough love. And that's something that sometimes referred to as the tough love in industry. And then the final kind of influencer of these programs I talked about was psychiatric institutionalization, because when these kinds of programs really hit it big is when the De-Institutionalization movement of the 1970s was really, or 70s and 80s was really coming into play, as like former asylums, or as whatever as they called them, were being shut down. People needed to, parents who didn't know alternatives needed somewhere to send their kids, and so these programs really started to take off and become more popular. So thinking about how the industry itself operates, this is just some commonalities that lots of programs have. They utilize educational consultants. These are people who are essentially paid to advise parents about where teens should be sent, or about what kind of treatment is best for their child. But the thing about educational consultants is they're usually paid by these programs. So if they get like a finder's fee basically for sending kids there. So obviously, there's an incentive. They also, many of these programs diagnose oppositional defiance disorder, which I believe has been taken out of the DSM-5. It may not have been, but it's a form of conduct disorder that I personally I don't believe in the existence of oppositional defiance disorder. That is something I will leave up to each of you, but essentially it's a diagnosis of kids who are oppositionally defiant in their everyday lives, which I think is pretty common for a lot of teenagers. Obviously existing on a spectrum from more minor to more, major behaviors. They also kind of utilize fear mongering. There is an excellent book about by a guy named Zach Bonney, who's a friend of mine, who wrote about his experiences in a CEDU program, and his book is called Dead, Insane, or in Jail, because something that the programs used to say to parents when they were, not so sure, on the fence about sending their kids away, is they would say, if you don't send your kid to our program, they are either going to end up dead, insane, or in jail within a year. And so using that kind of fear mongering and pseudo psychology is a way that programs would get parents to kind of, especially parents struggling with like burnout and fatigue of dealing with a struggling teenager. It was a very easy way that a lot of programs get kids to kind of engage, or parents to kind of engage. And then finally, they encourage the use of transportation or deception in order to transport kids to these programs. So I've put in quotations here that sometimes transportation is colloquially referred to as gooning, because it's essentially kidnapping. Paris Hilton, when she talks about her experiences, talks about, the two men who break into her house at 4 a.m. to take her to the program. And they put, I've heard some people have talked about having bags put over their head, being handcuffed, being threatened with guns or other weapons. And the kind of line that it's always used is, do you want to go the easy way or the hard way? And that's like the kind of line that's very commonly used, because, kids can go the hard way where they're dragged out forcibly, or they can come willingly. And so that's transportation. Some programs encourage the use of deception, or, basically just like lying to the child about where they're going. I heard a story about a boy who really, really wanted to play in the NFL, and he was a really good football player. And his parents told them that they had signed him up for this like really, really expensive football camp. And so he got dropped out, but they really were taking him to wilderness therapy. So all he packed was football gear. And when he showed up at the program, I was speaking to a guy who worked at my program who had this experience, and he was like, I had to be the one to break it to the kid that like, this is, you're not at football camp. That's not what this is. And he basically just like had to wear his football gear until they could get clothes for him. So before and then during, within the actual operation of the program, some commonalities that they have are the use of like a level-based reward system for attaining basic rights. So essentially, like, you come in on like orientation level or level 0 or whatever, or different programs have different names for it. And then you can like earn your way up to the next level by being good, or you can lose levels by being bad. And with each level comes different things that they refer to as privileges. For example, you know, having the right to go to the bathroom with the door closed, or having the right to take a shower without someone watching you, having the right to wear your hair down, not to wear it up in a ponytail, having the right to wear jeans, wear shirts that don't have a collar on them, communicate with your family on a more regular basis, listen to music, basic things like that, that, you know, stem from rights to, you know, basic privileges that, you know, we consider commodity of life. They also kind of employ a strict punishment system involving manual labor and isolation. These are referred to as individual reflection time, sometimes being out of agreement, as they'll call it, if you're out of agreement with the program. There's a very strict punishment system, which we'll get into, I believe, on the next slide. They also restrict communications with family and friends. So, you know, not allowing students to have any communication with the outside world at all at the beginning, moving to, you know, limited and monitored communication with family members and a few approved friends. But that's something that you earn, as well as you earn the right to speak to your parents, you earn the right to speak to your siblings, and you earn the right to speak to friends that your family and your therapist have agreed that you are like safe, good friends to talk to, and not of like the bad crowd, as I was talking about earlier. And then finally, the use of some kind of attack-based therapy. So most programs utilize, this is something that again comes from the cult model of Synanon. They played something called the game, where basically the point of the game was for everyone to scream insult at whatever person was like in the hot seat until they broke down, essentially. And so iterations of the game have appeared in lots of programs, maybe not quite as directly. I know that some programs utilize, they do like positive, negative, where you say like a nice thing and then a critical or constructive thing that's not. Or some programs play some version of the lifeboat game where you go around and you can only have 3 people on your lifeboat, and you have to decide which people you die and which people get to come on your lifeboat. Things like that that don't, I think, make any kind of evidence-based sense in terms of, you know, treating children, but yet still stem from the kind of histories of these programs in, you know, Synanon and other roots. So here's a list of abuse tactics of these programs that have been commonly identified by, I think, again, I put the links in the bottom for where my resources for where I found different things. So these are some of the punishments or abuse tactics that they use in these programs, which is deprivation of food and sleep. And it's not always just deprivation of food as a whole. Sometimes it's just deprivation of hot foods, like you're only allowed to eat cold food, or you're only allowed to eat expired food, or, you know, things like that, or just deprivation of food as a whole. The use of isolation and solitary confinement. I believe that I want to say the United Nations, or maybe it was the US government, had said that being in solitary confinement for longer than 15 days is inhumane. I think it's the United Nations, that being in solitary confinement for more than 15 days is inhumane treatment and is dangerous. And yet these programs will utilize isolation and solitary confinement for months and months at a time. And sometimes that means, you know, being in the 6x6 concrete room. Sometimes that means being set up in a tent outside off campus, which I'll get to in a second. Some kids in programs have been forced to eat bodily fluids. For example, if, like, you know, they're not able to keep food down, and they have to, there's dangerous use of physical, chemical, or mechanical restraint methods. There are, like I said, there have been over 350 deaths in these programs, and a lot of them have been because of incorrectly used physical restraint methods. And so that's something that, you know, they're used more frequently than they should be and not safely trained. Also, the punitive use of restraints, so using restraint for punishment rather than what it's supposed to be used for, is like in a situation where a teen is like genuinely like out, like having a breakdown and is out of control and they need to be like restrained for their own like safety, that's one thing. But programs will use restraints just for punishment when they disagree with the child's behavior. They also do forced and excessive exercise. I think I mentioned hiking 10, 12, 18 miles a day, every day for weeks. These military methods of discipline and forced labor, deprivation of basic necessities, food, water, sleep, access to a bathroom. They restrict social interaction or social ostracization. So things like forced silence, not allowing students to look at, interact with, or communicate in any way with anyone else, students, staff, anybody. So basically like you're not allowed to exist within the world. I mentioned earlier that one kind of solitary confinement that's utilized is being put on a tent. So where I say exposure to harsh elements like extreme heat, snow, or rain, whether or not, it's extremely hot or snowing, they'll still make students sleep in tents outside when they feel that they have been bad. Mentioned attack therapy, conversion therapy, aversion therapy, sexual shaming, forced sexualized behavior. A lot of programs do rape reenactments for rape victims, and sexual abuse as a form of treatment. And then peer hierarchies, where children are made responsible for punishing and restraining each other, because that, kind of presents its own little way of, when you're forced to make someone else be punished rather than you being punished, it's a way that they kind of break kids down and gain kind of their autonomy away from them. So I think a big question that comes from this is, why don't kids speak up? Like, why don't, if this has been going on for how long, why haven't we heard more about this before now? And so this is a screen grab I grabbed from the website for breakingcodesilence.net, which I don't believe is active anymore. But this quote here on the top left, these are troubled kids, they lie, they'll do anything to manipulate their way out of the program. I might be mistaken, but if I recall correctly, that is a quote from the president of the National Association of Therapeutic Schools and Programs. So what happens when the child is suffering an abuse in these kinds of settings, if they do try to reach out, as mentioned before, any contact with the outside world that the child is having is being monitored and filtered. So their phone calls to parents or guardians are supervised by a counselor or a staff or therapist. So if during one of these contacts, the child tries to speak up and say, hey, we're being abused or being neglected, this happened to me, whatever, it's really easy for the person monitoring the call to step in, cut it off, and discredit them. Then, behind closed doors, away from anyone who would care about it, the child receives consequences, removal of privileges. So, if you want the privilege to use the bathroom with the door closed or to wear your hair down, you might lose those privileges if you speak up and have to endure punishments like silence, isolation, humiliation. And then, you witness kind of your peers try and do these things, and you see what happens to them, and it kind of creates a culture of like not wanting to speak up because who wants to be punished like that. So it's easier to just not say anything because you believe that no one will believe you and that your situation will become more difficult if you do speak up. Another question that gets asked often is, I don't have a slide for this, but why do parents send their kids to these programs still if this is going on? And the truth is, there's really kind of two answers to that, because there's two different kind of categories of parents. There's the ones who don't know, and there's the ones who don't care. And the ones who don't know, especially for kids who were sent away in the 90s, before the instant information age, a lot of times parents don't know any better. If you look at the websites for these programs, they're very, very impressive, and they look like real good treatment programs that are going to help your kids, especially like these days. So it's easier now that, people have been speaking out, and that there are, with Paris Hilton coming forward about her experiences in programs and stuff like that. There's evidence online as to the abuse that's going on in these places, and it's easier to kind of find that. But still, it's easy for parents to be deceived, especially when they're going through, the fatigue of dealing with a struggling teenager for however many years. And then, as I mentioned, the other kind of category is the parents who just don't care. There's the ones who aren't, who don't really care about the well-being of their children, who chose to have children for the wrong reason, who didn't want to have children, who don't like their children very much, etc. So, it's easy for a lot of people. It's easy for me to, kind of group everyone into the latter and be like, every parent who sends their child to these programs is an abusive parent and they're awful. When in reality, a lot of parents just didn't know any better, and they didn't have the kind of information or guidance that they needed. So, now that people are speaking up and that there's all these organizations trying to, fight these industries, which I'll get into in a second, it's becoming easier for that knowledge to be accessible. So kind of something that, another question would be asked is, how can we treat these kids safer than they are being treated right now? So the number one thing would be evidence-based treatment, something that's gone through peer review, has been approved by, experts in the field, which a lot of the practices of these programs are not. Also, culturally sensitive treatment and real culturally sensitive treatment, not pseudo-culturally sensitive treatment, like a lot of these programs utilize. A lot of programs operate on indigenous land. I mean, the whole United States is indigenous land, but a lot of these programs operate on indigenous land because it's easier to get, kind of access to, like, there's less regulations and state law and whatnot. And they'll utilize kind of the lingo, the literature, like the language of Native Americans in their area. Or for example, in Hawaii, there's a program on Maui called Aipono that treats eating disorders, that they utilize all these Hawaiian words, and yet there's actually no Hawaiian people on staff there. There is no kind of rooting in like Hawaiian culture or like Hawaiian treatment methodologies and how they operate. So it's just using the words to kind of sound fancy and to sound like they're culturally sensitive, but they're not. So ensuring that treatment is actually culturally sensitive, especially considering that, I think a lot of people tend to kind of dismiss this industry as, oh, it's just for rich white kids that, like are rebelling and get sent away. But in reality, a lot of kids in these programs are people of color who are adopted into white families, or people of color who, from their own families. There's a very high population of adoptees in these programs, people who come from different backgrounds, etc. It's a lot more diverse than I think a lot of people imagine when they think about these kinds of programs. There's also something here, the next 2 points I'm going to address in tandem, is care within an established community and addressing the family unit and treatment. Because often in reality, it's not just the teenager that has the problem and everything else is fine. It's usually a dysfunctional family unit. Something is not working between the teen and their parents. So it's not just the teen that has the problem, it's the family unit that has the problem. So addressing the entire family unit rather than problematizing the teenager is one way that we can, ensure for safer and better treatment. And doing so within the established community, I thought removal from one's community is never taking someone out of their community to treat them isn't going to help once they're returned to their community. And especially, you're removing them from their support system and from the people that they, their safe places. So trying to ensure some kind of treatment that doesn't involve removal from the community rather than aid in the established community is crucial. And then finally, the removal of just like a rewards and punishment-based system, because, I don't think that punishing people for not, behaving the way you want them to behave and rewarding them, it's just gonna encourage behavior based on like desire of wanting something, wanting some kind of reward of, oh, I'm going to be good because, I want to, have an iPod and be able to listen to music, or I want to be good because I want to be able to go outside. I want to be able to speak to people. I want to do things, and not, actually encouraging genuine change of behavior. So this is the question of what's being done about it as a whole, which is a lot, is the answer to that question. There are so many, especially in the last 2 years. So see here on the left is Paris Hilton. In 2020, she came out with a documentary in which she spoke about the abuse that she went through at, I think she had 5 different programs as a teenager, and about, being sexually abused, physically abused, drugged, kidnapped, etc. So she has done so much outreach and work about this. On the left here is her in Washington, D.C. Actually, I think it was this last week, in support of the Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act, which is currently going through federal, the House and the Senate, to become law. This picture on the bottom is her leading a protest at Provo Canyon School, which is the school that she spent the longest time at. You can see me in the back of that picture somewhere, but I don't know. And she has not necessarily founded, but has inspired a lot of people to kind of come forward about their own stories. There are a ton of different organizations: Unsilenced, Breaking Code Silence, ICAPA, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, National Youth Rights Association, that are fighting to, kind of bring more equitable treatment. Similarly, there's people who are speaking up who are families of kids who have died in these programs. So Justice for Naomi is a campaign by Naomi's older brother to, get justice. Her name is Naomi Wood. She passed away in a program in 2020. This picture on the right, rest in power Cornelius, was at a protest during the Black Lives Matter protesting in 2020 and 2019. Another Black teenager who was murdered was Cornelius Friedrichs, who was killed in one of these programs. He was suffocated to death for throwing a sandwich across the cafeteria in his program. And that's why, and so he was tackled by staff and killed. So there's been a lot of people who've been come forward like in support of getting justice for the kids who've died in these programs and who have died shortly after them. There's a list of the names of the deceased on the SIAD website, which again, I will make sure the link gets out to everyone. So we're gonna take a quick pause because that was a lot. It was very stressful. So if you guys wanna, take a breath, do whatever it is you do just for like a minute or two. My favorite hobby when I'm feeling stressed out is looking, this is really silly, is looking at pictures of people's cats on Amazon reviews for famous cat toys. So this is all just pictures people have posted as reviews of different toys, and they're hilarious. Like all of these cats are just really funny. So I figured I would put in something light, just, as a brief kind of, eye bleach breather. I'm a big cat person, but for those of you that are dog people, here's a dog trying to eat a cat toy in the bottom right corner. Yeah. Anyway, so now we'll move on to the second kind of portion of this event, which is I think me and Maya talking. I do have some more slides of things to show, but I'll kind of go back to them as the questions come up. But really quickly, if it's okay, Maya, I kind of want to touch a little bit about what my research is on first. Okay, so for my research focus, like where I've come from this is that many of these practices that are in the troubled teen industry find some kind of rooting in the discipline of psychology, whether it's, evidence-based or not, and are viewed under the guise of treatment. So for example, these are programs, I'll call themselves behavior modification programs. And that behavior modification is a form of study that roots back to B.F. Skinner, who's an early psychologist who really shaped that discipline. So my research and past study stipulates that these programs aren't treatment at all, but they're punishment in disguise as treatment. And so in order to find solutions here, we need to look at the troubled teen industry in the way that we view other forms of carceral punishment, like prison incarceration. And we need to seek solutions outside of the discipline of psychology, which is why I turned to peace studies, because I believe that if the harm was coming from psychology, we're not going to find the solutions there. And peace studies offers a much more holistic and community-based approach that I think is extremely beneficial. All right, I will here turn it over to Maya.
Thank you.
Should I stop sharing or?
Sure. We can see your full face. Thank you for that really informative presentation. And you're right, it is something that I imagine many people have not heard about. And I'm glad to see that there is movement building around it to improve conditions. My question first, I suppose, is if you can kind of delineate not simply the movements to gain justice and to heal, but also and to reform, but also abolition movements that exist, because you have shared with me that many of these programs should be abolished, not simply reformed, because they are not effectively bridging the youth and their families and communities, and more embedded approach is really the only pathway to justice. So can you speak a little bit about the difference between reform and abolition movements and your thoughts on it?
Sure. What I'd actually say is that, I think it's a lot more blended than people tend to view, because this is something that's caused a lot of discourse within the community of survivors, as some have said, like some people want reform, some people want abolition, and it's caused a little bit of divide. But in reality, I think that, I don't know very many survivors who think that, I think a common saying among us is like a good program is a closed program. And I don't know a lot of survivors who feel otherwise. I'm sure I know there are some, but I don't know very many. And I think that a lot of these organizations that I cited earlier that are looking for justice and reform view it as a stepping stool, not as an end goal. It's better than nothing. You know what I mean? It's a step that we can take to ensure safer treatment for kids, because I view it the same way that I view prison abolition, which, in my studies toward my master's degree here, I did a lot of criminological focus. So it's actually a slide I did want to share, sorry, which is, just kind of a comparison between prisons and the troubled teen industry, specifically private prisons, is what this infographic is talking about here. But there are a lot of similarities between the two. So I think looking at the abolition movement in the same way that the prison abolition movement is viewed is extremely beneficial, which, in my experience has been that obviously abolishing prisons is kind of the end goal, but it's not, something that you can expect as an immediate step. There are things that have to kind of go into, as you've mentioned, establishing safer alternatives, finding reform. And so to me, these organizations, at least I know in my work with like Breaking Code Silence and Unsilence and all these other places, is that a lot of people may have the end goal of abolition, but reform is just the next step that they're taking right now, because it's what we can do, it's how we can help, and it's the next step toward getting these programs shut down.
Thank you. And can you explain a little more about why it's so important that any solutions and recovery take place with the family, in community? Why is that the critical difference?
Yeah. A lot of times the way that these programs operate is they refer to them as the troubled teen industry. I have jokingly heard, and I'm not jokingly, from some people, heard people pose to change it to calling it the troubled parent industry, which I think is a little bit of a stretch, but is a very interesting notion. Because in reality, a lot of these struggles that they talk about, especially on that list, they talk about depression, anxiety, substance abuse, academic failure, low self-esteem, whatever. A lot of these issues stem from the household. A lot of these things, it's not just the teenager who's the only one with the problem and everyone else is perfectly fine. In reality, I would say a solid 90% of the cases that these programs see, it's a dysfunction within the family unit, not within the teen themselves. And so just removing the teenager from the family unit and from their community, taking them away, trying to make them better, and then sticking them right back into the same dysfunctional unit as before, it's not going to fix anything. So you need to address kind of how their community around them can support them and how their community around them isn't supporting them, in order to kind of find, I guess, solutions and healing.
Thank you. And sort of in keeping with that, I guess one of my questions is, are there any intergenerational or multi-generational approaches that you've discovered? I sort of think where there are sort of offsite facilities, but where parents and grandparents and uncles and aunts, where people are brought together and there is a sort of circling up and a familial embrace, that is taking place productively, or any programs or approaches that have that intergenerational duet.
This is actually something that I have focused a bit on in my research. So I specifically research restorative justice and restorative practices toward, assisting in these ways. And so one kind of, obviously, restorative practices is a very broad umbrella talking about a lot of different specific practices, and there are several different ones. I have another slide that kind of talks about some of the restorative based interventions that I have looked at in my research. So I think that this first one, there's something called victim offender mediation. I don't love that name, but and kind of the idea that mediating between the kind of two parties having a dispute is a way that can assist. So I think that mediation between, inviting kind of conversation between those generations, like you were talking about, is one way. Another that I really want to engage what I'm planning to do my dissertation research on when I pursue, when I get to that point of my PhD, is circle healing for program survivors, and trying to see how, we can utilize the circle process in order to treat survivors. But I think beyond that, that would be something that would be very interesting to apply, to survivors and family members of survivors, and parents and grandparents of survivors, and people who have, and also a lot of these programs they're very, they've been around for a long time. And it's something that it's not just my generation that's been in these programs. I have friends in their, 60s and 70s who have been in programs before. And so it's something that I think bringing it kind of bridges a gap, like a generational gap between these programs. Yeah, so that's kind of the last fourth one is something that I'm hoping to pursue with my dissertation research. But I think that, offering some kind of victim offender mediation, I'm looking for a better term for that, trauma-informed care and truth and reconciliation to address like more systemic harms are at least 4 ways that restorative practices can be used here.
Fantastic. Can I ask you, you mentioned trauma, to speak a little bit about the trauma that you've seen and experienced emerging from these programs? Do the young people find themselves able to sort of articulate the impacts of those traumas? I know there are multiple. And is there sort of a narrative of post-traumatic growth that has emerged from there in terms of, the young people being able to name their resilience, their value, the beauty of their leadership after experiencing what they've experienced?
It's definitely hard. And this is something that I think Paris Hilton's documentary and the following, like the celebrity disclosures that have come after, Bad Baby from the Dr. Phil show, that's, it's where her fame originates. I think Kat Von D, makeup artist, Earl Sweatshirt, the musician, et cetera, have come forward about their own experiences in these programs. But it's something that I will say I am by far one of the youngest members of the survivor kind of community that we've built, because for a lot of people, it takes a long time to wake up to the fact that like what we went through in these programs was abusive. This kind of, I'll go back to the slide I had up earlier of the abuse tactics that they engage in. And so people kind of look, at these things, and it's sometimes can feel safer to justify it rather than to acknowledge that it was harmful, because it's like, where do we go from here once acknowledging, that the help didn't help me? And so I'll say, like, from my own program, specifically, like my classmates and my colleagues, I was the first one to kind of really, at least that I know of, has really kind of started talking about it. And since Paris Hilton's documentary, I've had 2 or 3 of my classmates have kind of reached out to me and been like, hey, like, I get what you're feeling. But something that I hear commonly, is I'll hear some people who are like, yeah, I get it, but I can't handle it. I can't deal with that right now. Like, I'm not ready to address that with myself. And so a lot of the program survivors you meet who have come out as survivors and who have, spoken publicly about their stories, it's been decades since they've been out of the program, because that's how long it's kind of taken them to process. And so in kind of addressing that post-traumatic stress, there was never been a formal study done on rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in survivors of programs. I would imagine it's wildly high. Pretty much everyone I've spoken to has some kind of diagnosis or would have some kind of diagnosis. But a big problem that you find here is that, the harm came from therapeutic boarding schools, so people are reticent to turn to therapy for help, Like for me personally, it took me years to start going back to therapy again because I was too scared to. I didn't want to. And I remember not the first therapist I saw, but the first therapist I really felt comfortable with, I kind of was explaining this to him that like I didn't want to, it's not that I didn't want to be there because I was an adult. I was choosing to be there, but I talked about how uncomfortable it made me. And I remember he kind of moved the chairs around and he put mine by the door. And he was like, there, you were sitting right by the door. I am not in your way. You can leave whenever you want to. And that was the thing that kind of made me feel safer personally, was him kind of just being like, you are allowed to leave whenever you like, whereas like other therapists kind of take different, because big thing with these programs is detention. But I think that a lot of people in the healing that they're finding, people are kind of coming forward and realizing younger and younger because of these celebrities and these big people who have, like, famous people who have come forward about their experiences. But the way that people are finding healing is through activism, I think, through trying to get justice, through trying to make sure that this doesn't happen to anybody else. I remember reading a post from a friend of mine who went to the same high school I did, but 15 years earlier. And she was talking about how she just wished someone had come forward so that or someone earlier had come forward so it wouldn't have happened to her, and how she wished that she had come forward so it wouldn't have happened to the later people like me. And so I think that a lot of people, are now I come forward because I don't want some other girl in 15 years to look back and say, why didn't someone say something, So I think that that's where people are finding their healing, whether they're not able to look for it in more traditional kind of ways that people would seek healing from post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And maybe there can be a different kind of therapy, right? Something that I've been thinking a lot about is sort of like embodied social justice, right? And so this idea of perhaps somatic movement rather than talk therapy might be, for instance, very good for these particular traumas, or, some embedded community work, dance, expression. There's a lot of really creative stuff happening out there that doesn't mimic or echo the kinds of therapy that might be triggering, right, for kids who have emerged from these programs. I want to talk a little bit about Hawaii, if you wouldn't mind. We are here in Hawaii, and the Matsunaga Institute is embedded in Hawaii. So I guess I wanted to ask you, what are the system conditions in Hawaii in the context? And obviously, when we think of Hawaii, we think about programs that are culturally responsive, place-based, right? But you mentioned that a lot of the cultural programs, including one in Hawaii they named, are sort of surface level, like they're not really run by and grounded in the deep knowledge and Manaoan storytelling and craft of Kanaka practitioners, right? So I imagine there are a lot of outdoor wilderness programs in Hawaii, as well as perhaps surface level cultural programs. But can you speak a little bit more about the context culture and why those effective programs are where they might be here, what to emulate, but also the dangers of not looking at those things like culture in a nuanced way. Does that make sense? If you just speak a little bit about the landscape of Hawaii and your thoughts about how we can deepen the offerings and make them more valuable.
Yes, I can. I had a map of programs in the US as a whole and Hawaii. This is all facilities in the US and Hawaii. So obviously a lot of programs on the mainland. On the Hawaiian Islands, there are a number of programs. I think the ones that I would draw attention to the most, there is a wilderness program on the Big Island called Pacific Quest. That is, I think, the most famous program in Hawaii. It's very horribly referred to in the community as Princess Quest because they don't hike, they farm. So it's not, as necessarily physically rigorous as other wilderness programs, but that doesn't negate the fact that it's still, a very emotionally distressing experience. Like, for example, I spoke with a student who was I don't know if any of you guys remember the missile crisis of 2018 in Hawaii. It was like my first week living here. I definitely remember it. But I spoke to someone who was at Pacific Quest when it happened, and they heard the alarms go off, and they were asking the staff, like, what's going on? They heard their phones, everything, because the staff were allowed to have phones in the field. And the boy I talked to said that the staffer that was with them told them what was calling his, family, wife and children and whatever, or whoever family he had, to talk about, say goodbye, etc. And that when he kind of explained to the kids, like, hey, there's an inbound nuclear missile, like, we're all gonna die. the kids were like, can we please use our phone to say goodbye to our families? And the guy was like, no, it's against regulation, it's against policy for our program. So, I think about those kids who had to sit there for that 47 minutes that, we were all panicking and calling our loved ones. I was snoring peacefully, thankfully, but that they had to sit there for that 47 minutes, thousands of miles away from anyone that they knew, and thinking that, our parents sent us here because this is for our own good. And that's, and that's the last time I ever get to talk to them is that. But these programs, the kind of reason I bring that up is that the way that these programs, especially in Hawaii, operate, you get Pacific Quest on Big Island. You have the Big Island has a branch of Teen Challenge. Teen Challenge is an incredibly dangerous program. They've suffered, I believe that's where Naomi Wood passed away in 2020. They've had a lot of deaths. They've also contracted with the government to build those like migrant camps on the borders for migrant children in the United States on the mainland. So, they've done a lot of great things. There's also Aloha Youth Academy on Oahu. We have Sea Challenge Hawaii, which is on Oahu. It's a boat-based wilderness program, which is very interesting. There are a lot of different kind of facilities that operate here, and the way that sorry, I'm looking at the chat. The way that each of them operate, none of them are very rooted in kind of Hawaiian culture. And that's something that in response to this kind of outrage at the lack of culture, they've responded with like pseudo culture. We're like implementing these kinds of, I talked about Aipono in Maui, where they implement, the use of like Olela Hawaii in the way that they name their groups, or that they talk about. I know Pacific Quest, they go through like a graduation ceremony where they get like laid and like there's some kind of like face painting thing but none of it actually has any kind of cultural meaning. It's just made up based on what these people from the mainland think, like these haoles think Hawaiian culture looks like. And I don't, at least as identified on this list, I don't know of a single program that is run by Native Hawaiians. I'm sure that there are programs in place to treat people like struggling teens, but that probably haven't been identified as abusive programs. But any of the programs on this list that I know are not being run with any kind of cultural sensitivity. And that's something that I think is heinous everywhere in the United States, but especially, living here, like it's, I don't know if that answered your question. I see questions in chat though.
Thank you. I'm disappointed that you haven't heard of really successful models that can be duplicated, replicated, or grown. I know friends through the Waimanalo Health Center and Hui Malama Okekai and Pink Waimanalo, and some things happening in Waimanalo that are really thoughtful and truly culturally embedded. So, I mean, I know that they exist, but maybe too small, maybe not impacting a large enough percentage of the young people who would benefit from them. But this is an opportunity for us to grow. And I think that what you shared with us enables us to really be vigilant, right? To kind of check it out and make sure that these are meaningful, that they are supported and grown from community, as opposed to something that is sort of trite or cultural appropriation or what have you. So we have a couple of questions here. One is, are all residential treatment programs harmful in your estimation? My daughter has been in and out of the hospital for self-harm and suicidal ideation. She's been in Queens Youth Partial Hospitalization Program and Queens Youth Intensive Outpatient Program, and also Family Treatment Center. She is diagnosed with cluster B personality disorder. We are currently looking at a lot of residential treatment programs on the mainland because the local ones would be similar to what she has already participated in. So this is really tough, right? Here's a parent who wants so much to help their child, who seeks some kind of solution, and who has tried things and they have not been successful, and this is really scary stuff. So what's your message at this point to this parent?
I think it's very difficult to speak to specific cases when my research is broader as a whole, but what I will say, first of all, is that this seems to be the example when I was talking about the two kinds of parents. You get the parents that don't care and the ones that do. This seems to me, obviously, this is a comment that I'm not reading directly, but this seems like an example of a kind of parent that does really care. And that's, I think, the first step to what these, struggling teenagers need. And I'll speak as someone who has been diagnosed with a cluster B personality disorder and has struggled with a lot of those similar things as a high school student, that it's hard. There's not a lot of infrastructure for programs that do help, but I have resources that I can send you in terms of what to look for, in terms of if you're trying to find a placement that is safe for your daughter, of red flags to look for if, they don't allow you to communicate with her if you're not allowed like direct access and communication. If she's not permitted to, if it operates with a rewards punishment based leveling system, things like that. But ultimately, the number one thing that I would say, just from my own personal experience of being in a situation, not the same, but similar, is that being close to my parents is what helped me the most. And like being, so even if that means, even if there's not sufficient treatment on islands, I know Maya just mentioned a couple of really amazing alternatives and unfortunately I had not heard of, but that wherever it is that your daughter ends up being, for me, was being so far away from my parents at such a young age was really scary. Like I lived in San Diego, California, and was sent to a program in northern Idaho where I'd never been and didn't know anyone. And so kind of, I guess the main thing, I would love to speak with you after if I can. I'm going to put a link in the chat right now with kind of some community-based treatment options and safe treatment. But I don't know. I think that I just would say, like, my heart goes out to you and your family, and that I really empathize with what you're going through because I've been there myself. But that, as long as you can kind of continue to exhibit like patience and ensuring that, like, it seems like you put in so much care and thought into your daughter's treatment that, as long as you can continue doing that and ensuring that you're looking out for there was a red flags page I was going to send as well. Okay, and then here's a link to some of the red flags to look out for when looking at treatment programs. Okay, I just sent those both in the chat. So I hope that's helpful. And my email address has been shared, I believe, below.
Thank you. Thank you for your availability, to consult and talk through that difficult situation. And, to the person who sent that, our love, our hearts, our hopes are with you as you have to bravely move forward. Another question or comment here is, I like that family was brought up, as most of the time the family will not be involved in the therapy process, and as a result the individual ends up with no healing and more harm. But if we find ways to help the individual to have self-care and learn self-protection, like Maya was mentioning, alternative healing, then there is perhaps also hope to have individual sort of post-traumatic growth, right? So I guess the question that might be embedded in this is, what are some, I didn't really ask you, what are some of alternative healing approaches that you might have considered to be valuable and that you have heard of, and does individual self-care and protection sometimes help in the absence of family presence? Obviously, sometimes the families are, as you mentioned, very much a part of the problem. And so much so that perhaps solutions that are family embedded are not possible, and there has to be separation. And so what are some alternatives to perhaps enable the individual to take control of their wellness and to be self-protective?
A very good question. I have several kind of thoughts on that. And the first thing I want to, I guess, clarify my language a little bit is when I say that, the family is the problem. I don't mean to say that necessarily it's that means that it's the parents that are the problem. In some cases it is. I will say this with my parents are divorced. My dad's in the audience, so sorry, hi dad. But my parents are divorced, and like with my mother, the issue was she had kind of her own mental health stuff that precluded our ability to kind of form, a good relationship and whatnot. I won't get into that, but in some cases, for example, like in my relationship with my dad, neither one of us was the problem. Neither one of us were like my dad loves me and is a very caring father in person. There was a dysfunction in how we were interacting with one another and how we were understanding one another. So I think that, I kind of hesitate I think I used the word problem earlier, but it's because oftentimes the teen is referred to as the problem. And so what I would say is it's not the family that's the problem, it's the family dysfunction that's the problem. It's the kind of interaction between the parent and child that there's some kind of disconnect, whether it's intergenerational or just simply on a person interpersonal misunderstanding level. There's some kind of disconnect between communication. On that level, you were talking about kind of what can we do individually, and sometimes in these cases that are so bad, I speak from my own experience of being in levels that were so bad that I wasn't able to kind of engage with myself on an individual level. And so this is where a lot of therapists would kind of I'm sorry, I'm very sneezy today, where a lot of therapists would kind of engage with coping mechanisms and things like that. And so a problem with some of these programs is they remove your coping mechanisms. Like for me, a big coping mechanism is music. If you ever run into me on the UH campus, I will have headphones in. I love listening to music. I do it constantly. And that's something that these programs, that getting to listen to music, getting an iPod, it's a privilege that you earn. And so, having people's coping mechanisms be given as rewards rather than being utilized as coping mechanisms is very dangerous, in my opinion. And so, I guess finally to kind of answer this backwards a little bit, but when you were talking about kind of alternate forms of therapy, something that, I was saying with what I want to do with my dissertation research is circle healing for survivors, because I think a big problem that some people find with therapy is that oftentimes, at least something I've found, is that therapists don't necessarily know, they've studied this, they've gone to school, they've gotten their, licensure and master's degrees and some doctorates, and, they've done the practical work. And oftentimes people who go into the field of psychology did go into it because of some kind of personal experience, but there's no way for them to actively on that level understand what a struggling teenager is going through. And so in the circle process, it's less rooted in there's one person that's the moderator, the whatever, and the people that are there's less hierarchical, whereas everyone that's engaging has that kind of experience. And everyone who's there is there on the same level and on the same kind of not the same understanding, because obviously everyone goes through their own unique issues, but it's a way to kind of engage in a space with people who have been through the things that you have been through, rather than engaging with someone that you might not feel you can relate to as well. So that's why I really believe strongly in turning to peace building and peace studies focused, or peace focused oriented research in terms of how to treat these problems, because I believe it's much more community based. It's much more directly engaging with the person rather than just addressing their behaviors, and just overall more beneficial to both survivors of programs and struggling teenagers or struggling family units.
Well, thank you so much. And with that, we have run out of time, but have learned a lot. Thank you for the conversation, for your insights. Thank you to the audience for your attendance and participation. Thank you to Jose Barzola and the Matsunaga Institute and all who supported. To learn more about the Institute, do visit peaceinstitute.manoa.hawaii.edu. This conversation will be live through social media, recorded and published in long form via the Matsunaga Institute's YouTube page. Please do share the link with interested others and go out and create conversation around what you learned and heard today. And do please follow the Matsunaga Institute on Eventbrite to register for future events. With all of that, please take care. Wish you well, and see you around another corner. Mahalo.